This is Duke University.
Welcome. I think I know most of you, but maybe not all of you don't know me necessarily. Gennifer, Weisenfeld, Dean of Humanities. It's just a great pleasure to see so many people come out, and I think it kind of speaks to the fact that people are really interested in this topic and want to know more. So I think it's just wonderful everyone's here, and as Nicole rightly said, I think everybody just loves to see each other too. You get a chance to see everybody during the semester. Everybody goes off into their individual areas. So this is just a great opportunity. And I also would like to thank my colleagues here for taking time to share some of their collective wisdom with everyone, because I do think it's really important. Things are different discipline to discipline. They're different individual to individual. We don't want you to think that there's one blanket answer for everything, but we also want you to know the reason, the impetus behind this is for you to understand and know not only are grants important in the humanities, but there's support available for you. And we want to help everyone find things that can help support their research. And there's a lot out there. Sometimes you can't find it on your own, and sometimes you can find it and you don't know what to do with it once you find it. And so we want to make all of that more visible and available to you. So we have a two-panel kind of structure here, a two-part structure. We'll start off with some animating questions for this and pose them to our panelists here, who I will introduce in a second. But also, we'll get to your questions, because you were kind enough to submit some of your reasons for coming here, and we want to make sure that we address those as well, because they're important to know what your motivations are. But to my immediate left, we have Phyllis Rupprecht from the Chair of Music, Professor in Music, and has been a very successful grant getter, as have all of my colleagues here. In the middle, Professor Sarah Beckwith, Chair currently of English and also in Theater Studies. And also on the far left, Professor Louise Meintjes from Music and Cultural Anthropology. So, and of course my colleague Deborah Jenson, who everyone knows, the director of the FHI, so who will also be co-moderating and helping with all of this. So I think one of the first questions we really wanted, and the other thing is it's really important to know this is a pilot project. We want to do this and sustain it. We want to learn from you what's valuable, massage it and change it, and it doesn't have to always happen in this configuration, what would be most useful to you, so your feedback will be valuable. But this is kind of a proof of concept for us that this is valuable and should be ongoing. So this is the first time we've really done anything in this particular kind of iteration. So that's just important to know. Also, I'd like to thank the organizers here as well, Carol Warhouse, before I forget, and also Marty Rhodes, and all of the other people, and Joseph McNicholas, and Laura Eastwood, and all of that, and Alicia Gennifer. You can see here that we actually have quite a number of people here who work in the funding space. And of course, Becky's like here from development, who also works in foundation relations. So a lot of expertise. But just to start out, I think the big question of why apply? Why is it worthwhile to apply? Because we actually all have a lot of demands on our time, and you might think, I don't know, maybe I don't want to spend 10 hours or 20 hours putting together a proposal, and certainly not one that involves other people. It might be complicated and have all kinds of other demands on my time. So I'll pose that, and maybe we'll go down the line thinking about what the value has been to you and why you apply.
I think this is a great session, by the way, because I think it's good to demystify what is sometimes a process shrouded in mystery and confidential letters and emails that you don't want to show to other people, and we've all applied for grants and been turned down for grants, and that's just part of the process. So I think it's an excellent session, but why apply? Why put yourself through that potentially disappointing or demeaning process if you don't get the grant? The answer is you can get great resources to do your work, the work you're passionate about. So the reasons why I applied for grants were two reasons. One was to run an international conference. That was a conference grant. And the other more common reason for me was to get release time from teaching to finish major book projects, and I've done that twice, and had more than one grant in one case for a major book project that lasted several years. So you might well apply to begin a book project. For example, if you apply to the National Humanities Centre, which usually funds second or third or fourth books, you could be beginning a new book project having just finished one. They would fund that. Or you might apply to finish a book project that's well advanced, like your first book, if you're a junior faculty member, and you might apply to the ACLS or the NEH, etc.
So we're sort of answering why do it, what's valuable. Well, it is invaluable. It is simply invaluable to have the sort of dedicated time free of the normal responsibilities of teaching and administrating. If you apply to somewhere like the National Humanities Centre, you also have the joy of fellowship. That is to say, there are some grants you apply for where you will get them and you can sit at home and, with your cat on your desk and do your work from home. If you go to somewhere, if you're lucky enough to go to somewhere like the National Humanities Centre, you have not only that solitary time and this fantastic library service and support staff, but you also have the you cannot anticipate who your fellows are going to be. And this can have, I think, just astonishing impact on the development of your own project. So that's worth thinking about. The solitary, dedicated work of writing and reading and studying, but also the joys of a fellowship that can actually move your project in quite unanticipated directions.
So I agree with all of that, and I would add that one of the benefits that I didn't expect of having a fellowship, whether it's for the field or as a cultural anthropologist, or I'm thinking particularly of residential fellowships too, was the benefit of having a whole year without being tired.
Yes.
I mean, there's a way in which I think, especially if you've been at a new institution for a few years and teaching a whole lot and doing everything else at the same time, that you don't realize how depleted you are until you have a whole year not being tired. So, and another joy, kind of liberation, was realizing that you're indispensable to your institution. And I think that's an important thing to realize, that you and being away and everything goes on without you, and you think, oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think one other thing that just comes to mind that I do think is important and may not be as clear for people in the humanities is that grantsmanship is a category of achievement upon which you are assessed for tenure. It actually comes up in discussion at APT, whether you've had major grants, and even it's not about a monetary value, and obviously you're not supporting a lab like you would be in the sciences where it's literally necessary for your livelihood, but it's another external source of vetting. And there are gold standards of grants, and this will kind of feed into our next question about what you should apply for. We've already heard about ACLS, NEH, NHC. Knowing what are the gold standard of grants in your field and going for them and receiving them means you've had already, like applying and having a journal article accepted to the flagship journal in your field, is a category of achievement. And so going for them is not a waste of time, both in terms of collegiality, time off, inspiration for your work, but also for your CV. And that's a very real important aspect of it. So that kind of gets to the idea of what should you apply for, thinking about that a little bit. And you've already mentioned a couple of grants, but...
Yeah, I can't resist just adding to what you just said, though, because it does take time to write these grants, and you shouldn't think of that as wasted time.
Right.
Because even if you don't get the grant, following on from what Gennifer's just said, you are at that point networking writ large within your whole discipline by applying for that grant. And the labor of creating the grant narrative, which is typically a 3 or 4 page essay with bibliography and so on, that is you working on your project. And so that's not wasted time at all. So you actually, although it is a separate category, I'm going to take these 20 or 30 hours this month to really think about my book project and apply for these grants. That's work in the project that you're doing. It's not wasted time at all. You have to formulate things in a certain way, and in the process of figuring out how to formulate that for non-specialists, for example, you will be doing valuable intellectual work for the project.
And you can always take that and springboard to something else, because that nugget works for other things. So that labor is actually very useful down the road.
But in terms of the specific question Gennifer's raising now about what to apply for, it's important to figure out when to apply for what, because there are grants that specifically will be designed for book projects at a certain stage of the career. I think the ACLS has one that's specifically for junior faculty. And there's no point in applying for a grant that isn't earmarked for what stage you're at. So we mentioned the National Humanities Centre. That's usually a sort of second book type of place, although there are a couple of slots there for junior faculty.
But you could be junior and working on your second book,
yes,
which is
can.
not uncommon.
Yes.
So I think it's just they don't want you to use it to revise your dissertation.
Right.
That's it. It can be a second book project
Yes.
anywhere in the stage.
Yes. There are also grants we haven't mentioned yet, such as grants to go and work at a library to use specific resources, which might only be 3 months or 6 weeks, but those could be very useful as well.
And actually, as to what grants to apply for, I think that's incredibly specific. I mean, each of you come from different disciplines in different areas, so they're the obvious ones, a lot of these are for second book projects. So, I would mention things like ACLS and Guggenheim, but they really are for, on the whole, I think they would be sort of very, very tricky to get for a first book project. But, we have fantastic people to talk to about particular grants here at Duke, many of whom are actually sitting in this room. So you need to really educate yourself about that. Some foundations do theme-related things that change on a regular basis. Sometimes there are grants that might have to do with certain particular projects on diaspora or migration or on religion or any number of things, and I frankly wouldn't be able to speak to the depth and the measure of all of those kinds of grants, but there are people here at Duke who can help you understand what resources there are available to apply for, and it is obviously worth applying as widely as you can, I would say, and finding out as much as you can about the kind of resources available to you. I would say that for the sort of things that tend to be more thematically related, it entirely depends if your own project is on point. And I would not waste any time trying to change a project or gear it towards something that was extrinsic to to the grain of your own research. I would think that would not be a good idea at all. It's always hard to think about. I don't know if this is going to be another question than I'm anticipating, but when you apply for a grant, I tend to think, broadly speaking, the beginning and end of a project are the best times, but it's really hard to apply right at the beginning of the project. In fact, I think it would be very hard to write a very good application. I tend to feel you should be at least 2 chapters in. You really should have stuff behind you that you can show you've done, either articles published or have presented at conferences. This also helps your referees understand what it is you are doing, because that is maybe another question, but a very, very important dimension of all of this. You will always be expected to provide a timeline, and obviously grant issuers are extremely interested in you finishing projects that you say you are going to do. And, you must have a record of completion. So the timelines have to be really realistic. But I think the question of when you apply for what is actually a really interesting one, because you do not want to, you can have grants at the wrong time and you don't use them as well as you could. So the particular phase you're in a project, obviously it's always lovely to have free time. But actually, the right time is an art in itself, I would say.
So I would say apply for everything. I mean, in the sense that look for themed ones, and if they fit you, apply for them. If you're applying for one grant, considering how much work you're doing for one grant, do it for as many as are appropriate to you. And maybe you'll get one, maybe you'll get two. And then catch the different waves of grants that are appropriate to where we are at each stage, on the basis that I think that, I mean, it's in everybody's interest that all of us get grants, fellowships. So catch the first wave of, if you, there's the sort of wave of grants where you have to be within X number of years in relationship to your dissertation, as long as, except for the ones that are too much teaching. Catch the wave which is then about preparing for tenure. Catch the wave that is about first book or second book, and then catch the wave for everything else, right, after that. So when I say everything, I mean I would look at everything and see the ways in which you can stretch, and then decide what it is you're going to apply for.
I wonder if any of you would contextualize the translational role of grant proposals as part of the reason to apply. In other words, that you learn to present many different ways of looking at your project, to gear it toward different audiences, and that you translate the value and meaning of your work in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, one example that I'll give is part of my work as an ethnographer, doing work on aesthetics, music and dance. For this last project involved also working with in the context of HIV. And so I applied for some kind of health grants, not the huge scientific ones, and I got really good feedback from it.
Right.
So, I didn't get the grant, but I got through a couple of rounds and I got good feedback. So, and that kind of helped me figure out, how people outside of my field were reading.
I think it's a very important question. I should say, by the way, you should consider international applications too. I will just say that. I forgot to say that earlier. There are some obviously fabulous resources and humanities centres internationally. But yes, I think writing a grant where you clearly have to show the stakes of your project to a broad audience, a broad and changing audience, is absolutely vital, and it's actually a really, really good thing. You are not convincing the narrow subfield in which you happen to be working. They are not going to be the people reading your grant application. And writing a good grant application is just writing well, which means bearing in mind who your addressees are. And it only aids your intellectual thinking to have to explain the stakes of your project to highly intelligent but not necessarily specialised people, because we all get very, very specialist very, very quickly. That will only clarify and render more lucid what your project is and why it's important in the first place.
Yeah. I think, Deborah's question touches on what we're getting into now, which is, well, how do you write a strong application essay? What is a strong application essay? And the answer is it's an essay that speaks very broadly to non-specialists. There will be people roughly in a discipline, panel will be assessing it, but after that, actually, in many cases, it goes upstairs to the next office, and if the people upstairs running the whole grant operation don't understand your first sentence, they will just throw it out. You cannot hide behind sort of specialist meta-language, shop talk, jargon, trendiness. You can't. And so you have to write it as if you're trying to explain your book to your grandmother or your
well-educated grandmother.
Possibly, yeah, but you can't assume it. If you're writing a book about avant-garde British music in the 50s, they're not going to have heard the music you're writing about, so why should they care? You have to make it interesting for them, and intelligible for them. Or if you're writing about a region in Africa that they won't have visited, they have to still understand immediately why this is important. And it does get to the question of translation across disciplines, which is something that by definition is harder for us because we have PhDs and we're specialists, and we're proud of that, and we're unapologetic about that. But in this case, I think this is maybe what's so hard about grant writing is you feel like, well, why do I have to explain that? I don't normally have to explain what a 6/4 chord is, or you probably wouldn't want to mention a 6/4 chord because people would glaze over, But you have to find another way of explaining things that are very familiar to you, or deconstruction, or diaspora, or whatever it will be in your field,
Although there are some very specialized grants. For instance, if I'm writing to the Japan Foundation, I don't have to say it's an archipelago off the coast of Asia.
Yeah.
So, I think that's the keying what you think is common knowledge and what isn't is really important, and that's it really is tailoring it to the specifications of the grant. I just want to take a poll of hands. How many people know about Pivot? Okay, so only 3 people. All right, so this is really something important, and maybe I'll let Alicia tell you about it, because I do think this is probably the first point of entry, and it is such an amazing resource that we have here at Duke, and most people don't know that we're subscribing to it, and it's a great resource. So.
You want me to speak about that now?
Yeah, I think it's worth just bringing up what it is, because I think this larger question of what should I apply to and what's available is also based on you doing a little bit of recon and then taking it to some of the support staff and knowing that there's just even this portal to work with.
And I'll pop my website up in a little bit when we get to this half of the table and show you. And I'll show you a quick link to get to it. But basically, Pivot is a massive funding search database that Duke spends a lot of money to subscribe to, but it's worth it. It has all sorts of opportunities across the board, and there are a lot of international opportunities as well that you might not have heard of, but it's things you can be applying for, and you can set up saved searches. So every week, once you set up your search, you get a list of all of the new funding opportunities that match that search criteria, and you're like, oh, here's a new grant I can apply for. And again, you've done the legwork once, you don't need to do it again. And again, I'll say this in a little bit too, but I'm happy to come to any faculty member's office and show you how to set that up on your computer and work with you to set up some safe searches. And I think I've done that for some people in this room, and maybe they can say if that was helpful or not. I don't know, I hope it was. Sorry, I'm trying not to take up too much time. But again, it's a really valuable funding search tool, and I can work with you one-on-one to set that up.
Great, and we'll hear more afterwards in the second part, but I think it's important to know that there are all of these great resources here, again, not just human, but digital resources that Duke is subscribing to that give us access to a lot of information, and filterable information and search specific information. But then maybe we can go back to talking about strategies, because I think that's something that everybody wonders about. What's the secret sauce in doing these kinds of things? And part of it is, of course, matching your project and thinking about applying to appropriate things and phasing. I think this idea, that Louise rightly put her finger on is really understanding what phase you are. I tell this to graduate students too. Don't apply for write-up grants and research grants at the same time to the same entity, because they want to know, are you researching, are you writing? I mean, you have to kind of claim where your phase is, and I think that's something that's really, it's important to understand where you are in the project. But that doesn't mean you can't apply for seed funding for, a summer or something to do some preliminary research and then parlay that into a much bigger grant. But so what do you think are some of the key strategies for you, and what do you think have been some of the keys to the success, other than the great quality of your project, of course?
Of course. I was thinking about this last night, and I do think it's already been alluded to by Sarah, grant writing is writing well. A lot of it for me, when I've gotten a grant, I think there's a lot of luck involved in getting grants as well. So you could write a great grant proposal and not get it funded, and then apply more or less the same proposal next year and get 2 yeses. So there is luck involved, and so that's important to bear in mind. But I think the actual quality of the writing is the start and finish of the whole thing. So in terms of strategies, I think it's important to plan well ahead. I don't think you're going to write a good proposal if you just hear about the grant 3 days in advance and throw something together. Now, you can do that, but if you plan a couple of months ahead, if you're looking to write, what I've written here, I was sort of trying to do do's and don'ts, and I wrote, do write superbly crafted application essays. It's easy, just write a superbly crafted application essay, and you're all set, okay? And then I wrote on the second page, after I wrote some other things, I wrote, again, do write superbly crafted essay, because I do think that, I have had some experience as a program member, like reading on the other side of it. And so you've got to imagine their experience. You've got 100 applications, 100. And how much time will you spend on each one? 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 minute if you don't. You've got to be the essay that jumps out onto the short list of 10, otherwise you're sunk. So your essay has to immediately be absolutely lucid and attractive and exciting. It doesn't matter how good your project is, actually. If the essay doesn't do that, you're just not going to make the cut. The first cut is going to be for quality of proposal. However, the readers are defining that, and they define it for... But I think if they don't understand what you're talking about, you won't make the next stage where all the politics and variables you have no control over come into play. But what is in your control is to write absolutely the best writing you're capable of. You don't think of a grant narrative as kind of this utilitarian memo genre that doesn't have any literary flair in the way your book will. It has to be as good as the best prose in your book. And all your prose in your book should be good. There shouldn't be any lame pages. But it has to be really the best. So, but why do I say plan ahead? Well, you're writing a 3-page or 4-page essay, maybe 1,500 words tops, 1,000 words plus bibliography. I would start writing that a month or even 2 months ahead, and I would revise it 4 or 5 times, and I would show it to a lot of people, and I would polish it like it's a diamond that you're working on, a jewel. It's just got to absolutely, there must be no mistakes in it, there must be no problems of continuity, no moments where the reader would scratch their head. Everything, there must be beautiful signposting on how you're structuring, here's what I will do, here's what the book's about, here's what I've done, here's what I plan to do during the grant. And some little tricks for that, I think, you've got to arrange the allotted space, which usually would be 3 or 4 pages, very carefully. How can I use the 3 or 4 pages for maximum impact for the project I have? So will it be to my advantage to spend a page and a half reviewing abstruse theoretical notions in my field that are crucial to my book? Or will it be better to present some case studies because that's what I'm really good at explaining? Or will it be good to include chapter summaries at the end, and how much space, and should I do that really quickly or should I do that more discursively? And there's no rules about that, but I think you're looking for really impact. Just remember that pile of 100 applications. You want to be the application is absolutely lucid. Another trick, I think, is short sections and section titles, like intertitles in a movie. He meets his future wife, and then there's a scene. I don't know, whatever it will be. But, a section title, immediately tells the reader quite a lot in 3 words, and you've only got those 1,500 words. So if you think about it, every word you're writing, I was doing some math, what is it? So if you get, so each page might be worth $15,000. Okay, so how much time do you want to spend to get those $15,000? That's $50 a word. Okay? So it's really worth spending time on the drafting.
Ditto. To everything Phil said, it's incredibly important. This is not something that you can just, as it were, throw off in a few hours. And I might even go even further than you, say 2 or 3 months, because in a sense, it's about what you're doing every day in your writing. So, because obviously the quality of your project is something that's already taken months and years to build up. So you're sort of in training for this stuff anyway, in the broadest possible sense. But I can't I totally agree with everything that Phil has said, that this is something worth making time for. You will generally be asked to write something like a 1,000 or 1,500 word statement about your research project. Sometimes you'll be asked for a chapter-by-chapter breakdown. You will probably be asked for a timeline, and you will also have to supply a bibliography. Usually those are all the things you have to do to give the full picture of a really coherent project that's well on its way. I think that writing well is thinking well. So this is why it is not wasted time to do any of this, because you will be honing, advancing your project as you do this. Even if, as is very often the case, that actually your project, even by the time you've written it to the time you get it, has already morphed and changed and will morph and change. So the paradox of grant application is like writing any kind of prospectus, that sometimes you've written it and you tear it up because the most important thing is the next piece of writing you are actually going to do. The difficulty of grant application is it lies precisely in that projection. The projection of stuff you haven't yet done, which is why it's always helpful to have done a great deal before you even set out on the application process. So you do need to not claim the importance of your project. Anyone can claim the importance of a project, and that's normally empty. You have to show the importance of a project. And you do that, Phil rightly said, because what you are writing is exemplary of how you will be writing in the book, how you are explaining the importance of this work. It's exemplary work. So it has to show rather than make very grand claims and grandiose claims, which won't really get you anywhere. You have to actually try to show so that people can see what it is that you're actually up to.
Ditto. And what I could add to that too, in addition to the idea that you have to tell a fine story about you and your work to smart, tired people.
The tired word is coming.
There are also there's some additional requirements or different requirements depending on what kind of grant it is. So if it's a grant to a residential program, you also have to show that you're going to be a good hang. And I think there are different ways you can do that. One, that you can show that you're a generous critic. In how you cite people. Another is that you're going to be able to talk to people because you can talk in an interdisciplinary language. And a third would be that you can find connections. So in terms of thinking about if you're applying somewhere where you're going to go and join some other group, show that you're a good hang. And then another point also in relationship to the kind of timing relative to where your project is, and this is different strategies to think about. One is, I think, what you have to argue, whatever the status of your project is, you have to show that having this fellowship at this stage in your project, whatever that stage is, would be generative. Right? So it's, in a way, it's, a lot of funders are keen to have are keen to fund people who are close to the end of what they're doing, because it's going to help them, because they see, oh, this is doable, it's going to happen, this person's going to finish this, and then we can put it on our list, and that's going to help us get more funding so that we can sustain the program. So a lot of grants, there's, I think, a preference for later in the project, but that doesn't mean that you should only apply when you're at that stage. I think it's much more the case is, when would it be useful to you, and how can you explain why it would be generative at that time. So, and then another thing to factor in is also that if you're applying for jobs, if you're applying for fellowships, that even if there are times that seem like they'd be absolutely ideal for you, that's the year you'd like to get it, doesn't mean you're going to get it in that year. So I would sort of take a step back and say, actually, I'll apply for it as soon as I can, so that if I don't get it this year, I still could try again next year. So, and then a third strategy that I used successfully, and I really liked it, was when I've had sabbatical, I used my sabbatical, some of my sabbatical, to find things that I could apply for and to apply. And so that in the case of my junior leave, I actually got 2 years off consecutively through doing it that way.
That's outrageous.
I had a different chair then.
Exactly,
You've got to time these things.
But in both cases, it gave me the space to do it, and also then I sort of got stuff going while I was on sabbatical. Came back in the second, came back for a semester, and then I was sort of ready and fired up for a whole year. So it worked very nicely for me. And the other strategy I also used with great happiness, and also it was very generative for me, is I prompted friends of mine, like grad school friends, for instance, to apply for fellowships at the same time as I did, in the same places. And in the case of the National Humanities Centre, one of my cohort and I both were in a position to apply for grants, and we landed up there at the same time. And it was so fantastic to have somebody there who really knew the history of my work, and that I knew worked really well. So that was, I really recommend that as a strategy too.
One thing I wanted to throw out, again, this was something that came up from the questions from the participants, which is really an interesting issue about strategy, is who to ask and how to find recommenders. And I wondered if we could just speak to that a little bit too, because I imagine many people here are still asking their dissertation advisor to write for them, or maybe not, it depends. But sometimes you transition out of that at a certain point, and also there are times when you don't want to do that. So I just wonder what your thoughts are at the assistant level, particularly at that stage. Where you might look, do you look to colleagues? Is that not a good idea? Or I have my own thoughts on this one.
That's probably, there's probably a lot of answers to that. I suppose I would say you wouldn't look to colleagues in your own department. I'm not quite sure why I say that, but that seems to be clear. No matter what your department is. This has nothing to do with music, and I love my colleagues.
Just looks like a cheering squad.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It's not arm's length, basically.
Yeah.
And one thing that would be positive is I think you do want to look to colleagues who are maybe a little further along than you. So if you're assistant, people at the associate or full rank. If you're associate or full, people who are fairly senior, but not exclusively, but because I think in some cases it's helpful to have people who are recognized by whoever's going to read these letters as distinguished voices in their field. So if you just get your friend who you're in grad school with, who's also in their third year of their job, to write for you, they may write a great letter actually, but no one will, you won't get that sort of extra push from it being a really recognized person who's written several books. And if the person who's written several books thinks you're great, then I think the letter is going to help you more. On the other hand, those people are busy and have been writing letters for decades and sometimes write really lousy letters. And you won't know because you won't see the letter. So you really have, I mean, the short answer is you really have to trust your letter writers and find people even who you know are reliable, who are going to actually make the deadline or know how to use the website. I mean, I don't know. But,
It's absolutely.
I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but these are practical matters. But I mean, I agree with Louise. Apply for everything. But if you ask someone to send 12 letters for you one year, that's a lot of extra labor for them. So I would kind of share it around. I've sought people who weren't exactly in my sort of narrow subfield. I work on British music a lot, but my letter writers weren't British scholars. I don't really trust the Brits anymore, and they actually don't, but one of them was recently was an Americanist, the other was sort of a scholar of music theory. I don't know, but I knew that they also they had fellowships, and they sort of could make the case. What we're talking about, the translatability of the project. They can help you make the case that the project is broad.
Yeah,
that's one.
Your letter writers are tremendously important because they, having been on the other side, as well as asking for letters, being on the other side of reading just so many of them in various of my capacities. Sometimes your letter writers are so beautiful and lucid in the way they explain a project. This is just such an incredible gift. And so this is the most important thing. Do the people you're asking for really understand your project? Can they really explain it? Sometimes they'll explain it better than you're explaining it yourself.
But that's a problem. That's why you have
that's
why you have to write a really good application. Because I've read letters where the letters were better than the essay.
This is true. You don't want that to happen. Now, you do need distinguished people, but you should not simply be looking for famous and distinguished people as the sole criterion, because the most important thing is that people really, really understand the importance of your project. As a courtesy, I really think you really need to try to inform people a long time in advance when you ask them a long time in advance. Then, because you're always asking unbelievably busy people, give them as much help as possible setting everything up, because everyone has to do these online things the whole time now, and everything has a different portal to do. So you need to be crystal clear, lucid, deadline, dates, I'll send you, and give them massive reading time and due courteous notice for doing this. It is so irritating to get really late in the day stuff, it is so irksome. You try to do your best when you're on the other side of writing these things, but it is just, so that courtesy is, which obviously, it goes a hugely long way. First job I ever got, I asked someone who's now really quite famous, Lyndall Roper. She's a brilliant historian of the Reformation, and at the time she didn't have a job, and I asked her, she said, "You shouldn't ask me, you've got to write much better known people than me." I said, "No, I want you to write for me." Anyway, I did get the job, so.
Well, I do think that issue of the question of how does someone know you, in what context, because that's the first thing they actually have to put down. What context do you know this person in? True. And so longevity is important too. I've had people ask me for recommendations when they met me just once, because they think, oh, I'm in your field and you understand and what I'm doing, but that doesn't look good, because in fact that shows you have nobody who knows you longer who was going to write for you. And there's all kinds of inference. People read between the lines on these things. So I had to say, I'm happy to write for you, but I'll have to say we met last month. And that doesn't really bode well for you. And I think that's also, cultivating relationships in anticipation of asking people, letting them know what you're working on and keeping abreast, and also having meaningful interactions with them is really important, so that they really understand where you are in your work is worthwhile.
And
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with Phil. I don't think you should be asking anyone in your department. I don't think it looks good to be asking your dissertation mentors, because that just looks like, you're still writing your dissertation. You are a colleague, so I think best.
Well, you wean yourself off your dissertation advisor, and so those first couple of years as you're establishing yourself, it can be transitional, and you do use them, and it's always within that grain of salt. They understand that this is a person who's supporting you, but then they can understand, and the dissertation advisor can situate you in the transition from graduate student to junior faculty member. But as you're moving through that 7 years, I think you want to start thinking about who you're cultivating as that next set, which is why you go to conferences, which is why you share your published work with other people, and why you do collaborative things that form networks, because there's nothing, that network, those weak and strong ties are really what are the basis for asking, and you have a really good sense of that. So I do think that's extremely important, and it is true that the more famous the name, the better the letter is not the case at all. really somebody who shows, a really famous person who doesn't know you well and writes very personally about your project is really not as good as somebody who's more junior and still rising in a good institution who can write with more meaning and care about what you do. The other thing is, and maybe this might seem presumptuous to people, but I do this now, and I've asked people who write to me to send me that, is not what they want me to write, but what they're emphasizing about what they're writing about themselves in a few bullet points at the front, because a lot of times people send you 4 attachments of 5 personal statements in their CV, and nobody has time to really tease through that level of detail to find out, oh, that's the nugget of your project. So it's not presumptuous to put on your asking letter to say, or you could say, this is not presumptuous, but these are the things that I'm going to be focusing on, and I really see my work contributing to X or Y, and then they can hone in on that, because otherwise you're leaving it to the chance that they have a couple of hours to read through, and they may not. It just gives them a little entry point into your work to know exactly what it is what points you're hitting, and they can kind of amplify that. So that's really, really helpful.
Can I
Yeah,
say
sure,
one thing?
absolutely.
Having said that, my dissertation advisor still writes for me, and very generously, and I'm sure that's helped me all along, not because he's my dissertation advisor, but I think he's really phenomenal at being able to articulate what the strength of somebody's project is. So.
Do you think it's worth opening up for additional? We have other things, but we've covered some of the questions. Are there things that people submitted or questions that have come up since we've been discussing before we switch gears and talk more about real support mechanisms that people have asked about?
To apply multiple times to the same fellowship, does that in any way harm you? So to apply, the idea of applying as early as possible, because eventually that was your suggestion, right?
Well, I know that some grants will not let you apply more than once or twice, so you really need to know what the stipulations are within a grant. Also, I know just because I sit on the Japan Foundation Advisory Board, when you reapply, they have asked what is significantly different from the last time you applied. So just taking the same application and saying, it's a year later, I want money still, is not enough is not enough. You're assuming that you gave it your best shot the first time, and it wasn't funded, so you really need to say, I've rethought this, or this is a new phase, or it has to be something significantly different. And a lot of times, review committees serve for several years, and they're only rotating off maybe a quarter of the people.
So the same committee.
So the same committee is looking at it, or at least some of the same people, and they're going to go, I remember this guy last year.
He still sucks.
Right. So it's not to preclude reapplying, but you really want to think, what have I done differently? Not, I've got this, let me try it again. So I think that's really important.
So I think one of you said that timing is an art. Well, it seems to me grant writing itself is sort of a dark art anyway. I know that Carol said one time that one of the keys to getting grants is to build relationships with grant foundations, with the people that are reviewing your grants. How do you do that? Especially when you're busy teaching and researching and writing, and these people aren't necessarily academics.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
I actually had experience with that. That came up to me with the NEH, because they do send a representative to the musicology conference once a year, which is a big conference of 1,500 people. And I didn't meet with her initially, but I applied for a small grant for a conference and got it. And then after I got it, they were encouraging me to apply for a larger grant. So, I mean, because they also, you might assume it's hard to get these grants, and it is hard to get them, but you assume you have, 1 in 100 chance, but really, if you write a good grant, you might have a 1 in 10 chance. They're looking for good applicants. They also need applicants to apply. So if they get a good grant for someone for a conference, and that, they realize this is someone who can write an application and maybe might have another project that was a collaborative conference, but might have a book project. And so,
Start small.
So they actually, start small is good, but they actually sort of cultivate junior faculty coming up and gave good tips about how to write the grant. I don't want to exaggerate how much it was, and it continued, because after I did get an NEH for a year off to finish a book, then they have their pound of flesh, and then you have to go and serve on the NEH. But then you learn a lot from reading the grants. So you do cultivate a bit of a relationship.
So can you say more about actually meeting the grant people at conferences? I didn't know they went to conferences if they're not academic. So how
Well,
do you
it's
find-
only happened to
I
me
mean,
once
there's
or twice
1,500
with the
people
NEH
there,
people.
right?
Sorry?
If there's 1,500 people there,
Well, you make an appointment.
They'll have a booth down in the publishing hall or something like that?
But no, you email them
I've
before
never
you go to
seen
the
them.
conference.
That's why I'm asking.
No, you make an appointment weeks before the
Right,
conference.
okay.
And I wouldn't assume that all these people at foundations are not academics. 90% of them are PhDs and they are academics and they have fields and they're working in administrative areas as well. So
And
they
they've read
sometimes come out.
thousands of applications,
Yes.
more than we've had hot dinners.
But it is true that I don't know if you can always get it behind the wall of an institution to know. And sometimes that's through your intermediaries, which is the university that has some relationship, which is why Carol and Beth and people who know foundations can really help you with those types of things, and they have some.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, I think Meredith, when we were talking more globally about foundations and not specifically about fellowships.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's far more difficult to connect with a decision maker at an entity that's giving a fellowship. Because, I mean, well, there's the Japan Foundation or NEH. I can speak a little bit for the National Humanities Center where it wouldn't do you any good. And also their selection committee, unlike the Japan Foundation, changes every year.
Yeah.
And so your chances, for example, of getting to know those people is purely chance.
Right.
And it's not even published who's on the selection committee. That's held confidential. And also, so your chances in any given year would be different because the selection committee would be different.
And those committees usually draw from previous fellows.
Yeah.
And so finding people who've had those grants within your cohort or within the senior faculty, you can really get a feel for what the ilk is, and they might even be willing to share what they propose with you. Because looking at a successful grant application is probably one of the best ways to understand what a successful grant looks like.
Also, I mean, just to add, since it hasn't come up, I mean, I think Duke have been, with Gennifer and Valerie's help, really concerned to set up mentoring structures for all assistant professors. So you should use your senior colleagues. This is exactly the sort of thing. Would you mind reading my grant application? And they will do that for you.
Some of them will, some of them won't.
I wanted to follow up on Phil's comment about contacting people ahead of time before the conference. So if members of foundation boards or the NEH aren't listed in your program for your conference, I'm right to the organizer and say, who can we expect in attendance from these organizations? They should be able to provide you with that. If they don't, you might suggest to them that they actually have a panel at some point with those people on it. Because as you said, they're often academics, they often have a view of a field that's unique, and they often can identify where a field is going. So that's a good suggestion to professional conference organizers.
All right, so do any of you guys already get the Monday newsletter, the Funding Alert newsletter? I see a couple of nods. If you don't get it, you can subscribe right on the right there. Every Monday, I send a newsletter out that lists funding opportunities that were put out the week before. And again, you can look just at the arts and humanities ones. It's great. Again, we were talking about Pivot. There's a link to that right there. And again, I can help you if you have any questions with that. It's pretty user-friendly, but if you do have questions about setting up some searches or using the resources, please contact me. Again, there's a contact us page right at the top here. Oh, this website is researchfunding.duke.edu. But again, I have cards. Come talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to give you all of this information. Some other useful links here, federal grants, foundation directory, and a link down here to some Duke internal funding resources. But the main meat of the site is this search box right up here. I'm just going to go ahead and click really quickly on advanced search to show you how it works. Again, you can just do a simple keyword search right up at the top here, or you can just go ahead and check some check boxes. Each box that you check narrows your search further, so keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and click Arts and Humanities, and I'm going to go ahead and click Junior Faculty. I'm not going to click anything else. I didn't test this in advance, but they should come up with a fair amount of things. And again, you can also, if you wouldn't be looking for institutionally limited things, but you can narrow those out if you want to. Again, you can check fellowships if you want to. Funding agency name. You can type in, now start typing in National Endowment and it will pop up, National Endowment for the Humanities. You can also look for internal resources here, Duke University. Again, federal or non-federal, and again, you can sort of narrow by deadline, date posted, search all opportunities or search open opportunities. Quick sidebar here, we're talking about preparing these things months in advance. So a lot of these things are annual. If you search all opportunities, you'll see things that were due like last June that maybe you can apply for that are due again in this June. So just keep that in mind when you're searching these. So I'm gonna go ahead and click search. It shows sort of the furthest out ones first, and then the older ones as you go through, there's 152. So here's the sort of top 20 here. You can see NEH did announce their fellowships for this year. They're due in April. We'll see how long that lasts, but it's very exciting. In the meantime, last year again. And again, you can further narrow these if you want to. You're like, oh, I only want to see the ones that are interdisciplinary. You can check that box. Oh, I do only want to see the fellowships. You can click on funding type here. And here's 95 of these are fellowships. Some of the rest of them are going to be grants and things. So again, this just gives you a quick idea of how this database works. Again, this is all tied into the Monday newsletter, so I think I don't want to take up too much time. Again, please come talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to come to your offices and work with you to search for things. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll go ahead and minimize this again now. Questions?
Just sort of a comment about that. As a way of knowing in your own field which grants people are getting, if you get a newsletter from, I'm a musicologist, so I get the AMS newsletter, they announce who wins what award, and you sort of see, well, we tend to get a lot of these, but not those, and it's going to be different for each discipline, so that will be a way of figuring out the track record in a discipline.
Was there on Pivot, create an account, sort of? How does that
Right,
work?
you need to use your Duke email address to set up an account so it knows you're affiliated with the university. Since I said Duke does pay to subscribe, and we pay quite a hefty fee, frankly, every year. But once you have an account, you can use it for anywhere. You don't have to be
But does that mean that it actually remembers searches you were doing, or not?
Right, and you can save those searches. So that way, again, there's an email that comes out once a week, and I have like 12 or 14 saved searches, and all the new things come to me in just one email. And you can also track certain opportunities, so that way, again, you're like, oh, I think this is going to be due in June, but it hasn't been announced yet. You can track that, and when that new deadline is announced, you get an email.
And you can do monthly or weekly alerts, right?
Yeah, there's all different ways you can use the tool.
That's great.
Anybody else? Joseph, you want to say
I'm
a
next.
few words?
Okay.
You're next.
Yeah, actually, it's a good segue from the April 12th due date, right?
Yes.
For NEH. So I'm Joseph McNicholas. I'm the new director for the Franklin Humanities Research Institute's research opportunities. I'm not the director of the Institute, I'm the director of the research opportunities. And I've been helping faculty for about 16 years getting grants and other kinds of things. I had a stint as a congressional relations person for a university, which was wonderful because I got to write the shortest grants in the world, which are federal appropriations. And they just say $1 million for X university, and they get into the federal appropriations bill. And the reason I'm commenting on that is because I wanted to say there is a lot of fear about the NEH and its future because of President Trump's budget proposal. But for those not familiar with the federal budgeting process, perhaps, it's a long, long time before what he proposes is going to become any budget anytime soon. And I say that because the NEH has massive bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats, and the reason for that has to do with local politics, right? NEH is one of those places where for a small amount of money, every single congressional district gets sprinkled with a little positive news. About NEH specifically, they're due, the fellowship program is due April 12th. There's a digital humanities fellowship program as well that I think is due the same date.
Yeah, that's new this year.
Yeah, so it's very important, as you heard from the last panel, to know how your specific funding agency works in terms of its reviews, in terms of the roles of its program officers, okay? Phil's comment about the NEH program officers is really important. Their job is to put together a portfolio of funded grants that looks awesome when it's all done. Like, so they can go to their bosses and say, look what a great job I did in getting together this fantastic panel of grants. And they'll be there year after year. The program officer will be. So getting that relationship with them is helpful. The panel, however, is created de novo year after year from experts around the country. So, as you also said, you can submit the same proposal this year. This panel doesn't like it. Well, that panel's not there next year. So it's worth coming back. But talk to the program officer in between. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Right now, the fellowships have about a 7% funding rate. Okay, 7%. Again, I would guess like 50% of those are absolute junk. So your scholarship, which is going to be polished like a gem, it should rise up and have a much better chance than 7%, to be honest. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I served on it once in the program committee. We were there all day, there were about 100 we had read, and there was a spreadsheet and everyone's scores were, and 50 or 60 straight away we didn't talk about it all. And then there were several others that were borderline, there were sort of 3 or 4 that everyone thought were great, but then there were some you really discussed. Yeah, and we spent all the day discussing 6 or 7 others. Yeah. And it was pretty clear to all 7 or 8 on the panel. Right. Yeah. So if you write a good proposal, you've got a much better chance than 7%. Yeah. I mean, that's the average chance.
Right, so. I agree. And in general, the NEH programs overall range from, let's see, what do they range from, 6% to 40%. Now, that's another game that some people play maybe later in their careers, is they look for where's the most likely funding to happen. That's another way to look at it. If you could figure out a way to apply to the 40% program, that's, you've got substantially better chances. But that's gamesmanship for down the road. Just to be clear, the stipend for an NEH, the actual payment for an NEH stipend is $4,200 a month or $50,400 for the year. So you're not going to make bank, but
one thing I want to add to that is that a new policy, or one you might not be aware of because I wasn't, is that for all assistant professors, if you receive a major grant over $25,000, Duke will make you whole. So you should not worry about that. That's awesome. It's really important to know that, because you may be worrying that that's not your salary, and that's been a big change and important for assistant professors particularly. So.
That's a great policy. Yeah. It's wonderful.
Can I add that that's not pervasive across the country? I think you're
it is not.
Very lucky that Duke feels that way.
Yeah. For anything over that threshold. Obviously, they want to do it for a $25 grant, but obviously any major grant, and they, that's the.
25,000 is the.
$25,000
actually
is the
20,000 is on the
website. Is it 20?
Yeah, it's on the
Okay.
website.
And
I verified that with
Great. And that's it for NEH, unless people have questions, but we've got more to cover. So
yeah. So Laura, do you want to talk? Laura, you want to talk a little bit about what happens in the back of the house?
Sure. I'm Laura Eastwood. A lot of you know me from the work I've done on Humanities writ large over the last. This is now year 6 of our 5-year grant. And starting this fiscal year, I'm also dedicated to working with faculty on grants that are not Humanities writ large. And so whether that is fellowships or research funding projects or whatever, and most of our humanities and interpretive social sciences departments don't have dedicated grant managers, and they don't have business managers who are particularly familiar with doing this process. And so I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And because part of that is we want to make your job easier, but part of it is we also want you to come work with Duke systems in a way that it's been hard to do in the past. And so I know several of you have sent out numerous fellowship proposals this year, and you didn't know that Duke's interested in having those go through the sponsored project system and be in the program and have it work so that when the university leadership is looking at the work that faculty are doing to get outside funding, the work that you're doing quietly on your own is not visible to them. And so come to me when you have proposals to send out, and we will work together to get them through the sponsored project system in a way that is not cumbersome or painful for you, and makes your work visible to the university leadership. And then when you are successful, I'll work with you on figuring out the best ways to get the money processed, whether it's to come to Duke to go to payroll, or if it's to come to Duke to be spent on travel, or how we're going to manage those systems, how we're going to work with your individual department. And then when you're done, how we're going to close out the project, making sure your reporting gets done on time, proving that we are good stewards of these resources. And there's a really a new focus across the university and throughout the research support offices to helping make sure that the system that's built for something different than what you all do is not hindering you in doing what we want you to be successful in doing. So we really are here to help.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, so what I want to talk about, I was going to talk about the importance of timing. And so many people have talked about the importance of timing that I won't, but I think that I can't emphasize it enough. Senior faculty have emphasized it enough. You need to plan well in advance so that my office can help, so that you can get your recommenders, ditto, what's already been said. Another thing that I wanted to address is that one of the elephants in the room, which is the Mellon Foundation, because some of you may not know that the Mellon Foundation provides more funding in the humanities than the NEH. But they do it much more quietly and actually much more securely.
Not that this is a competition.
No, securely. But in terms of junior faculty, I think the thing that's most relevant that you may want to be keeping your eyes open for is a program called the New Directions. And I know I've talked with some of you in here about that already. The thing to emphasize there is that this is an invited program. There are a couple of things, the New Directions as well as the Sawyer seminars, which Duke has to be invited to participate. And we are frequently invited, but we are not invited every year. So when we are invited, a call will go out to let all of you know that this is happening. There will then be an internal competition, so that the last time it was convened by Ed Ballason's office, Associate Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies. And so you'll be competing with your colleague because in general, at least the last time this was done, only one application could go forward from Duke. In past years, it's been more than one depending on the program, but last year it was only one. And so then there will be a series of dates and things that that review. There'll be an internal panel of senior faculty that will review the application. My office will help you, as well as the senior faculty, help you put together the proposal. There'll be a lot of resources available to you before submission, and then as well if you win after the award. There really aren't other kinds of Mellon projects that just go forward. These are controlled by the Provost's office. She is required at the request of the Mellon Foundation to approve anything that goes forward. Individual faculty may not submit directly to the Mellon Foundation. They will simply be turned back. So that's just important for you to know. It's not our doing. We were just, Dean Weisenfeld and I and the provost were just at the Mellon Foundation, and the senior VP reiterated that this is what they want Duke to do. So just so that you're aware, because I know there are all kinds of things that circulate about how do you get to the Mellon Foundation? Well, that's how you go. So if you have something that you think is really important, I would encourage you to talk with your department chair, with your dean, because it's really the deans and the provosts that come together with the priorities that go forward. So the next thing I wanted to just mention is that, as Dean Weisenfeld mentioned at the very beginning, this is a pilot series. Actually, it's a pilot series of 3 workshops that we're doing. The first one was we talked with the faculty chairs to let them know that this was going to be an emphasis. You're our second one for junior faculty, and on April 4th, we're in the midst of planning a 3rd workshop, which is going to be for mid-career and senior faculty. And at that point, we're going to focus more on broader projects. So when you've got something where you want to collaborate with a colleague in your department, across departments, across schools, you are looking for more resources that you will bring to bear on a particular issue, field of study, something where we really do we need to start looking outside of Duke for additional resources. And there are over 60,000 foundations out there in the world, nonprofits. Now, don't get so excited. I mean, not all of these are giving money in the humanities, but my office and with Joseph's help, with Laura's, we all collaborate on these things very closely. And it's our goal to match you with the best foundation for what it is you're trying to do. And we're going to talk more about that in more detail on April 4th. So now I'd just like to open the floor to other questions. Anybody has
Or
any?
can we go to the April 4th one, even though it's for mid-career and late-career people?
Depending on enrollment, yes, because they'll get first priority, and if there's room, certainly. And we're evaluating this. We're hoping to do this on a regular basis. So you're going to be getting a survey. So we'd love your feedback. There's always room for improvement, things we could be doing better. But we'd like to roll this out next year if there's sufficient interest. My office actually just is planning to also roll out similar things for different sectors. So for the social sciences, for the natural sciences, et cetera. Because the needs are different. I'm sure you've been in situations where all they're talking about is NSF, and that may not be very interesting to you. Though there probably is a small portion of NSF funding that may be of interest. So that's kind of the plan.
Now,
Okay.
I got to say, after Carol's boast about that Mellon Foundation, I did some fact checking.
Yes.
And I found, of course, Carol's right. The entire budget request for the NEH for next year is $150 million. The entire thing, including staffing. Whereas the Mellon Foundation gave away $210 million.
I knew that.
I didn't know that.
Got a question?
So thank you very much. This has been inspiring and also, okay, yeah. Sure, okay. So I think one of the questions I have has to do with when we apply for grants that buy out our classes, negotiating that with our departments. Louise is here. I like the idea. I love being in our department, but I also think that there's can you speak a little bit about telling your chair that you're going to be gone for 2 years, or how we need to?
You breaking news.
So that
I can speak a little bit to this because I think it's a really important issue, and I think you don't want to spring this on your chair. That's the one thing. I think this has to be done in consultation with your chair, not because they want to prevent you from doing anything, but they need to make plans, and they need to at least know. And there's a formal process where you have to actually have a contingency plan where you put in a placeholder for your leave. And so every year when you get that thing that says, do you think you'll be on leave, even if you don't know, but you're applying for something, you should consult with your chair and tell them you're thinking about it. They won't keep you from doing it, even if it's not your junior research leave or your sabbatical, even if you don't have an earned sabbatical. We don't discourage junior faculty from applying for things, even when it's off cycle from their leaves. But you do have to ask your chair, and you do need to submit on that form that says you may potentially be on leave. We won't hold you to if you don't get it, you want to come back and teach. We're not going to say, well, you can't have your salary. But it's really important because that affects budgetary things and it affects your department. So you'll engender a lot of goodwill if you automatically are transparent about your plans. I think that's really important. Also, in terms of leaves, just know that there has been a general move in all of our peer institutions, not just Duke. And I feel very ambivalent about this, honestly, about moving away from course releases tied to grants. Unless you're away. I mean, a leave is a leave and you're away. But getting funding to do something, even a journal or something, and tying that to a course release, I have just actually surveyed all 10 of our highest peer institutions. None of them are doing that anymore. What? I know, it's a kind of for editing a journal, yes, and which is a very high level of service, for instance. And then there are other things as well, doing collaborative things. And I know that's something that weighs heavily on junior faculty's minds, particularly because we're emphasizing that we want you to be collaborative and involved in lots of things, but then we're not giving you course release time to do it. And I think that's a bit of a tension there. So I think you have to take that equation and that calculus into your mind when you do these things, because it has been a big change in culture, and it's not just Duke. I think the rationale that I understand behind that is that they don't want to put research in tension or in an adversarial role with curricular teaching and needs. And so even though time-wise they are, in a sense, competing for the same human resources, and at an institutional level, they don't want to incentivize things through making you move away from your teaching. And so that's the rationale. Whether we agree with it or not, or we think it's practical for what we do or not, is another issue. But I think it's really important to be cognizant of that, because there's still a lot of expectation and holdover.
Jennifer, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If the people here decide to apply for, I don't know, one of these grants, and it may not be when you're coming up for your, let's say, your post-renewal leave.
Right.
You would put in a leave request form.
Yes.
Yes.
You must.
Right. So you must put in a leave request form, even if you know, I doubt I'll get this grant. You put in the leave request form anyway. Because the cycle is that the chairs will send you that request. If you are applying for grants, fill out that form. We forward that to the deans, and the deans are making overall decisions about, how many leaves apply from the whole department, because we can't suddenly have a third of the whole department going on leave at once. Otherwise, we can't function anymore.
There's in fact a rule that more than 25% of the faculty of any one unit cannot be on leave at any one time.
That's just for Trinity, though, just for the arts and sciences. Because Divinity, that will definitely.
I don't know about the other schools, but for Trinity, and so we have to weigh that, because for small units that can be 2 people. So we definitely have to weigh these things, and we do prioritize junior faculty, because you might think of the opposite, prioritize senior. That's not true. We know how crucial it is that you have time to do your work before tenure, so we prioritize junior faculty, but we need to know what you're thinking.
Just to add to that briefly, I mean, in general, I think that Duke University, where I've taught for 10 or 11 years now, is superb at supporting junior faculty and every faculty research compared with other universities I've taught at. So it's not really a problem, but, something like 2 years in a row is a little bit exceptional, but people do it, especially if you're doing field work or something. I mean, it's very much discipline specific. It would be very unusual in music theory, say, but I mean, how much practice? No, but the question I'm getting at you, if you were serving in your department as an officer of the department, like a DUS or a DGS, it's always important to be transparent with your chair what your plans are, and December 1 is when those applications are due, so it's like 9 months ahead, but especially if you're doing something service for the department, like one of those officers' roles, that might be the only time where a chair would say, well, you just started, you've just done your first year as DUS, I'm not sure, if you would go, if there's any flexibility, don't take the 2 years in the next 2 years, or wait 1 week. It's unlikely they would do that, but the earlier you have the conversation with them, the better, because they are just trying to juggle what those 20 faculty are doing. Or in a large department, it's probably not going to be a problem.
So I just want to turn to my comment about the joy of realizing that you're indispensable. That as a labourer, you are dispensable.
Yeah.
It's actually okay. If you go to your chair, just remember it. You are dispensable. Yeah. So even if you're in the middle of DUSing or something, you are still dispensable. Right? And so it makes it more difficult to chair in the department perhaps, but much more important is how you are as a scholar and researcher. That's your first priority. So just.
And we do think that prestigious grants are important, and we prioritize them because we know it's so important for you. So that's definitely. Just do know that it's not great to be away years and years while you're a junior faculty member, because that's another thing. Service is something that APT also looks at. So while it's really wonderful for you, you buy into the university is important. It's always a balance. 2 years is, I think is reasonable, but people like get 5-year Humboldts and they want to go off and be somewhere else. That's at a point where we say, do you still want to be here? That kind of thing.
faculty don't know you either. I mean,
Well, that's the
faculty just don't
other
know you.
thing is that people can't claim, they can't attest to you as a citizen.
Yeah.
And that's what is part of coming up. So it's all about the balance of the triangle.
Whenever I'm going to ask for something, I always want to know if there are boundaries or rules or guidelines. So if you don't know it yet, admin.trinity.duke.edu, there's a faculty affairs tab that has lots of useful information that you might want to read up so that you know what are the things Duke is already prepared to support if you just know to ask for it.
Yes.
Sorry. Admin, ADMIN, .trinity.duke.edu, and then the faculty affairs tab.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.